Welcome to the debate. Today, we are diving into something you see everywhere. I mean, millions of athletes and, well, just everyday gym goers are stepping into freezing water every single day.
Oh, yeah. You literally can't escape the imagery online right now.
Exactly. It's always that same shot, right? The cascade of ice cubes dropping into a steel tub, the steam rising in a dimly lit room, and someone stepping in with their eyes closed.
Looking like they're undergoing some profound spiritual awakening.
Yes, it has basically become the ultimate modern recovery ritual. People absolutely swear by it.
They do. But the real issue we're tackling today is the biology behind it.
Right. What if this incredibly popular practice is actually biologically erasing the muscle growth they just spent an hour sweating for? Today, we're exploring the physiological impact of cold water immersion, specifically ice baths, following physical training.
And we're really looking at that stark divide between muscle hypertrophy on one hand and athletic recovery on the other.
Exactly. The central question before us is this: does cold plunging actively sabotage muscle growth by blocking critical biological stress signals, or is it an essential, high-utility recovery tool for athletic performance? I assert that cold water immersion fundamentally undermines muscle hypertrophy by blunting essential cellular growth signals.
And I contend that for competitive athletes requiring immediate performance recovery, the systemic benefits of cold plunges far outweigh the localized cost to muscle growth.
Let's start by looking at the actual cellular biology of how muscle tissue adapts. Because I think the fitness industry has developed this massive misunderstanding of what recovery actually means when your goal is to pack on new muscle.
Right. People think it's just about resting.
Exactly. But muscle growth is not a passive event that just magically happens while you sit on the couch. It requires a highly specific, very loud stress signal. When you lift heavy weights, you are causing micro tears in the muscle fibers.
Which essentially initiates a cascade of localized inflammation.
Yes. Now, people hear inflammation and they immediately think it's a bad thing, like it needs to be treated or iced away. But in the context of lifting, that inflammation is the direct trigger for the mTOR pathway.
The famous mTOR pathway.
Right. You can think of mTOR as the body's primary biological on switch for protein synthesis. If you want a muscle fiber to thrive and grow, that signal absolutely cannot be muted.
Which brings us to the data, I assume.
It does. We have robust data on this, most notably the landmark 2015 study by Roberts and colleagues. They designed this beautifully straightforward experiment. It was a 12-week strength training program.
And they split them into two groups, right?
Exactly. One group of participants did an active warm down on a stationary bike, and the other group spent 10 minutes in a 10-degree-Celsius ice bath immediately after their leg sessions.
And the results of that study are widely cited for a very good reason.
They are. I mean, imagine putting yourself through 3 months of grueling, heavy squats. You eat right, you sleep well, and you endure all that physical toll. But because you sit in an ice bath for 10 minutes after every session, your legs barely grow a fraction of an inch?
Wow, that's rough.
That's the reality the Roberts study exposed. The cold bath group experienced significantly less muscle mass growth and notably smaller strength adaptations compared to the cycling group.
Because of what happened at the cellular level.
Right, the biopsy data showed us exactly why. The cold water effectively suppressed satellite cell activity and blunted that mTOR signaling cascade for up to 48 hours post-exercise.
So it just shut it down.
Completely. The cold didn't just soothe the muscle, it slammed the brakes on the entire anabolic response. By trying to skip the discomfort of being sore, these individuals were, biologically erasing the very growth signal they had just worked so hard to generate.
Look, I'm not disputing the cellular biology. The Roberts data is incredibly clear if you're only looking at it through the narrow lens of getting bigger.
Well, getting bigger is a pretty major goal for most lifters.
Sure, but I approach this entire physiological landscape through a vastly different framework. We really have to separate the dedicated hypertrophy phase lifter from the in-season athlete.
Okay, fair distinction.
Physiology, at its core, is always a game of trade-offs. The human body does not operate in a vacuum of optimizing just one variable, like muscle size. Think about a competitive soccer player during a dense tournament schedule.
Or like a CrossFit athlete doing multiple events.
Exactly. A CrossFit athlete who has to perform 3 distinct, high-intensity events in a single day. For those individuals, the absolute priority is not maximizing a microscopic amount of potential muscle tissue over a 12-week period.
So what's their priority then?
Their priority is restoring immediate muscle power, clearing out metabolic waste, and critically, reducing the neurological perception of fatigue.
Wait, but clearing waste at the expense of long-term adaptation seems like a really steep price.
It is a necessary price depending on the goal. When you plunge into cold water, you are eliciting this massive survival-driven vasoconstrictive response. The blood vessels in your limbs aggressively clamp down.
Right, the whole shrinking effect.
Yes, which literally squeezes blood along with acidic waste products out of the peripheral tissues and forces it back toward your core. Furthermore, you trigger a systemic shift in the autonomic nervous system.
Into the parasympathetic state, right?
Exactly. You force a shift into the parasympathetic nervous system, your body's rest and digest mode. You are essentially rebooting the central nervous system. I'd argue that losing a marginal, perhaps completely imperceptible amount of potential hypertrophy over a season is an incredibly worthwhile trade-off.
If it wins them the game.
Exactly. If that ice bath allows the athlete to step back onto the field, perform at their absolute peak, and win the game that same afternoon, it's totally worth it.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective, especially regarding this whole idea of prioritizing feeling fresh. Trying to stop inflammation after a dedicated hypertrophy or strength workout is like turning off the fire alarm while the building is burning.
Okay, that's an intense analogy.
But it fits. Yes, you stop the loud, annoying noise, which in this case is the soreness and the acute fatigue, but you simultaneously prevent the biological firefighters from ever arriving at the scene to fix the damage.
By firefighters, you mean the immune response.
Right, the macrophages and cytokines, which act like a cellular cleanup crew and signaling flares, and most importantly, you stop the satellite cells. These are basically biological spare parts that hover around the muscle fiber.
And they respond to the inflammation.
Yes! When they detect inflammation, they fuse to the damaged fiber and donate their nucleus so the muscle can physically expand its capacity to manufacture protein. When you jump into an ice bath, you are slamming the vascular doors shut.
Because you're drastically lowering the tissue temperature.
Exactly, which slows all these enzymatic rescue reactions to a crawl. The inflammation isn't an accidental side effect of the workout. It is the workout's intended biological payload.
But everyday lifters don't always see it that way.
No, they don't. When everyday lifters, people whose primary goal is simply to look better, get stronger, and build muscle, when they see elite athletes using ice baths, they mimic the behavior without understanding the context. They are actively seeking the comfort of feeling fresh, and in doing so, they put out the fire before the structural remodeling can even begin.
I come at it from a different way, because your firefighter analogy, while incredibly vivid, assumes that the local fire in the muscle is the only thing that matters to human performance.
Well, for structural growth, it is.
Sure, but you are equating the localized inflammatory response in the bicep or the quad with the entirety of the body's readiness to perform. Let's look at the systemic reality of multi-event athletes and the central governor theory.
The central governor theory.
Right. Feeling fresh is not merely about psychological comfort or avoiding soreness. It is a profound neurological necessity. The central nervous system governs motor unit recruitment. It dictates how many muscle fibers you can fire and how fast you can fire them.
So you're looking at it from a software perspective.
Exactly. Think of the nervous system as the software running a high-performance car's engine. Even if the engine, the muscle itself, has plenty of fuel and no structural damage, if the software detects that the system is overheating or overwhelmed by systemic fatigue, it will step in.
It puts a hard limit on your RPMs.
Yes, to stop the engine from blowing up. The brain literally stops sending electrical impulses to the fast-twitch muscle fibers. It forces you to slow down to protect the organism.
And you're suggesting the cold plunge acts as a bypass for that software?
Exactly. The cold plunge essentially reboots the software. When an athlete gets out of the freezing water, the subsequent warming up, the rush of blood back to the limbs, the endorphin release, and that parasympathetic shift we talked about, these aren't just comfortable feelings.
They're biological signals.
Right. They are physiological states that convince the brain the crisis is over, permitting the nervous system to fire at maximum capacity again. If a sprinter feels heavy and lethargic because they are drowning in localized inflammation, their biomechanics will alter.
Which leads to injury.
Yes. They will compensate, they will lose a fraction of a second off their start, and they risk acute injury because their firing patterns are compromised. The biological firefighters you mentioned are great for a slow 12-week renovation of the house.
But not for game day.
Exactly. Right now, the athlete doesn't need a renovation. They need the software rebooted so the car can win the race in 2 hours.
Okay, that's an interesting point, though. I would frame it a bit differently. The central nervous system software analogy is entirely relevant for same-day performance, but I think we need to look strictly at what the data tells us about chronic adaptation versus acute relief.
Let's hear it.
Let's dig deeper into the physical reality of the Roberts 2015 study. You mentioned earlier that the Roberts data is clear if you only look at it through the lens of getting bigger. But getting bigger and getting stronger are intrinsically linked for the vast majority of the gym-going population.
Sure, they usually go hand in hand.
Right. When the active recovery group in that study, the ones just lightly pedaling on a stationary bike after lifting, were measured over 12 weeks, they exhibited a steady, climbing staircase of measurable muscle growth. It's a beautiful, thriving upward trend of adaptation.
And the cold plunge group?
In stark contrast, the cold bath group essentially flatlined. It wasn't just a minor statistical difference, it was a fundamental suppression of the organism's ability to actually pack on new muscle.
But remember the protocol they used?
Yes, these participants were immersing in 10 degrees Celsius water for 10 minutes. This wasn't some extreme, torturous protocol designed to freeze them solid. This is exactly the baseline duration and temperature most commercial cold plunges and fitness influencers recommend.
True, that is the standard protocol.
Exactly. And by introducing that specific thermal stress, they definitively chilled the anabolic response. If we are discussing the efficacy of physical training and the ultimate goal of that training is physical adaptation, using a tool that demonstrably stops adaptation seems entirely counterproductive.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You're applying a highly controlled 12-week dedicated strength study to every training modality under the sun.
Science is science.
But context matters. You are elevating the bodybuilding metric to be the universal metric of success. If the training itself is the competition, if we are talking about a bodybuilder or a purely aesthetic lifter who only cares about muscle cross-sectional area, then yes, I concede your interpretation is flawless.
Well, thank you.
But if the training is just preparation for a field sport, the entire paradigm shifts. The metrics for success change entirely. An in-season basketball player lifting weights on a Tuesday doesn't want to carry localized inflammation into a Thursday night game.
They want to recover.
Right. They are not trying to maximize hypertrophy in January. They are trying to maintain baseline strength while clearing out metabolic byproducts. And let's be specific about those byproducts. We're talking about things like hydrogen ions.
Which acidify the muscle.
Exactly. They acidify the muscle environment and physically block the fibers from contracting optimally. The Roberts study isolated muscle growth in a vacuum. It didn't track an athlete's ability to execute complex, explosive, multi-directional movement patterns under immense fatigue over an 82-game grueling season.
Okay, but tissue health still matters for an 82-game season.
Of course it does, but if you tell an NBA player to embrace the heat and inflammation after every single training session, you are essentially telling them to play their sport at 85% capacity so they can maybe gain a millimeter of bicep thickness by the time the playoffs arrive. It is a fundamental misapplication of the science to a population that operates on a completely different set of biological demands.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, really, because it creates a false dichotomy where athletes somehow don't need to prioritize tissue remodeling. I mean, even in season, micro tears occur during every game and practice.
Sure, the damage is always happening.
Right. And if you chronically suppress the MTR pathway with ice after every single session, you aren't just missing out on looking like a bodybuilder. You are potentially impairing the tissue's ability to heal and strengthen its tensile capacity.
You think it leads to breakdown over time?
Yes. Over a long season, weakened tissue that hasn't been allowed to fully repair is a major factor in structural injuries. However, I am willing to acknowledge that the demands of a high-frequency competitive schedule require compromises.
Which is exactly my point.
But that creates a massive problem for the hybrid athlete or the dedicated fitness enthusiast. How do they get the systemic reset, the dopamine hit, or the joint pain relief without completely killing the muscle growth? This is where the timing of the physiological cascade becomes critical.
I suspect we are moving toward the timing buffer.
Precisely, the 4-hour rule. We don't necessarily have to throw the cold plunge out entirely for those who want to build muscle, provided we respect the biological timeline. When you finish a heavy lifting session, that mTR activation and the localized inflammatory response spike significantly in the immediate aftermath.
Those first few hours are crucial.
Exactly. Those first few hours are the critical window for the stress signal to be registered by the body. If a lifter still wants the systemic benefits of the cold plunge, the mental resilience training, the mood elevation, the shift toward parasympathetic recovery for sleep preparation, they simply need to wait.
Just delay the plunge.
Yes, the rule of thumb is to wait at least 4 to 6 hours after the last set before introducing any kind of cold water immersion. By implementing this buffer, you allow the acute, localized signaling pathways to operate completely unhindered.
The fire alarm runs its course.
Exactly. The fire alarm rings, the biological firefighters arrive, the rebuilding process is fully initiated, and only then do you safely plunge to manage joint discomfort or prepare the central nervous system for rest. It's a compromise that respects the cellular biology while still utilizing the tool.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the logistical reality of tournament play?
How so?
Well, I completely agree that the 4-hour rule is a brilliant, elegant solution for the dedicated lifter, or even the off-season athlete who completely controls their own schedule. It beautifully harmonizes the desire for hypertrophy with the systemic benefits of cold exposure.
But
we have to discard that rule the moment we enter a competitive crucible. Let's look at a track and field athlete running preliminary heats, or a martial artist fighting multiple bouts in an afternoon. Often, they have maybe 2 hours between intense, maximum output physical efforts.
true, the schedule is tight.
There is no luxurious 4 to 6 hour window to sit around waiting for the biological cascade to finish its work. In those moments, the athlete's body is overwhelmed with acidity, their nervous system is frantically trying to down-regulate power to protect them, and their core temperature is dangerously elevated.
So you're saying immediate immersion is the only option?
Immediate cold immersion in that specific scenario is not about long-term tissue remodeling at all. It is about rapid thermal regulation and acute pain management. You plunge them immediately because the sole objective is to mechanically and neurologically reset the organism so it literally doesn't fail in the next round. The 4-hour rule is absolutely the gold standard for long-term physiological development, but on the day of competition, immediate immersion is what keeps an athlete from breaking down.
You know, that distinction between long-term development and acute survival is the exact crux of this entire issue. The problem arises when the general public conflates these two entirely different states of being.
Yeah, people see what the pros do and just copy it.
Exactly. A person doing a standard Tuesday evening leg day is not in a competitive crucible. They are not stepping into a fighting ring 2 hours later. Yet, they finish their squats, feel the burn, and immediately jump into an ice bath because they saw a professional fighter do it on social media.
Context is everything.
It really is. They are blindly applying an acute survival protocol to a long-term development process. And by doing so, as the 2015 data clearly translates to reality, they are actively blocking the very adaptation they went to the gym to achieve in the first place.
They're shooting themselves in the foot.
Yes, the inflammation is entirely necessary for them. The heat, the swelling, the delayed onset muscle soreness, that is the biological currency they must pay to buy new muscle tissue. When we artificially lower the tissue temperature and clamp down on that vascular response right after a workout, we are essentially stopping the transaction from taking place.
I think we are actually circling a profound point of convergence here, even if our priorities differ. The utility of the ice bath, or any biological intervention for that matter, is entirely dependent on the specific goal of the individual.
Know your goal, choose your tool.
Precisely. If we look at the two distinct paths we've discussed, the individual focused on hypertrophy and long-term adaptation on one side, and the athlete focused on immediate performance and fatigue management on the other, we see that neither approach is universally incorrect.
They're just different tools for different jobs.
Exactly. It is simply a matter of applying the right physiological stressor to the right desired outcome. The biological trade-off is undeniable. You are either blunting the MTO signaling pathway to restore immediate central nervous system power, or you are embracing localized inflammation to maximize tissue growth.
Right, you can't really have both at the exact same time.
The danger, as you rightly point out, is the mindless adoption of protocols. The everyday lifter needs to understand that the cold plunge is a powerful dial. If you turn it up at the wrong time, you completely mute the signal you just spent an hour trying to amplify. But for the multi-event athlete, turning that dial immediately is the exact mechanism that prevents their nervous system software from crashing.
Exactly, though I want to emphasize that even for athletes, chronic suppression of adaptation carries long-term risks that shouldn't be ignored. But yes, it comes down to respecting the immense complexity of human physiology, rather than falling victim to hardcore fitness trends.
The trend chasing is out of control right now.
It is. We live in an era where people want to stack every possible intervention. They want the perfect heavy workout, followed immediately by the perfect sauna session, followed immediately by the perfect ice bath.
Doing it all at once.
Right, and they do this without realizing that these biological signals can fundamentally cancel each other out. If your primary goal is pure muscle gain, you must respect the stress signal. You must endure the heat and the inflammation, and let the ice wait until the biological work is securely underway. The very mechanism of muscle growth demands it.
I'll concede that everyday lifters overuse the cold plunge to their own detriment. But we must also respect that elite performance is rarely about having the absolute largest muscles. It's about being able to recruit the muscle you have safely and effectively under immense systemic fatigue.
That's a fair assessment.
For the athlete whose success is measured in speed, power output, and neurological readiness on a specific day, cold water remains an unparalleled, high-utility tool. The nuances of recovery physiology dictate that context isn't just a factor, it is everything.
Well, this has been a fascinating exploration of the tension between adaptation and recovery. There is clearly much more nuance to explore in recovery physiology, from the precise temperatures used to the duration of immersion, to how different muscle groups respond differently to thermal stress.
There's always more science to dig into.
Always. Our goal here is always to illuminate these complexities so you can make truly informed decisions about your own training, rather than just following a trend. And speaking of making informed decisions, don't forget the call to action. Like and subscribe to the Nuanced Lifter channel to keep cutting through the noise and stay nuanced.
I couldn't agree more with the need for nuance. The science of human performance is constantly evolving, and the absolute worst thing we can do as practitioners or enthusiasts is lock ourselves into a rigid ideology.
It really is. Understanding both sides of this biological coin, the absolute necessity of the inflammatory fire for growth and the undeniable utility of the ice for systemic reset, is what ultimately leads to intelligent training outcomes. It brings us right back to that opening imagery of the shivering athlete in the ice tub. The next time you see that video on your feed, or the next time you consider stepping into the cold water yourself, you have to stop and ask a fundamental question about your own biology.
Why am I doing this?
Exactly. Are you unnecessarily putting out a fire that desperately needs to burn to build you back stronger? Or are you strategically rebooting your nervous system for the battles ahead?
That is the exact question every single person must answer for themselves before they take the plunge.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep examining the evidence and keep challenging your assumptions.